Imagine one night you're listening to a poetry reading at the Gaslight. Then you head over to Cafe Wall where you catch Lenny Bruce on stage as he delivers a biting tirade about his obscenity arrest. Later, you wander over to hear John Coltrane perform at the Village Vanguard before gathering with friends in a tiny apartment to discuss Kerouac and Sartre until the dawn. It's just another storied night in 1961 in the Beatnik enclave of Greenwich Village. The following day, as you walk through Washington Square Park, you're immersed in the energy of the bohemian community, its coffee houses, live performances, and creative spirit. It feels otherworldly compared to the small town you left behind. You hope this feeling never ends. But little do you know that within just a few short years, the Beatnik subculture you are immersed in will be gone. By the end of the decade, the poetry readings will be a distant memory, and the icons that lit up the stage will be long gone. While the Beatniks embark on a journey to escape a life of conformity and the artificiality of consumer culture, they are seeking genuine connection, creative freedom, and a deeper understanding of existence. But along the way, they are met with serious challenges, taking on authoritative forces, societal changes, all the while battling a dark turmoil from within. The end of the Beatniks marked the end of an era and the end of one of the most fascinating subcultures in American history. To uncover why the Beatniks movement ultimately collapsed, let's look at how this once thriving subculture came to be, what changed, and what ultimately led to its demise. And ask yourself along the way, if you could turn back the clock, would you have chosen to be a Beatnik? We had been reading about these Beatniks who hung out or lived in Greenwich Village, and we wanted to know what a Beatnik was. And so a friend and I went to the source. What we learned, of course, was that Beatniks were mostly artists. Richie Havens. In mid-century America, the Beatniks emerged as a cultural reaction to a pre-planned life in suburbia that awaited those coming of age in the post-war era, which could be punishing and cruel to anyone who came across differently in any way. They don't treat Beatniks too good in Texas. Port Arthur people thought I was a Beatnik, though they'd never seen one, and neither had I. Janis Joplin. The Beatniks were hipsters, followers of the Beat generation, who were a group of influential writers and artists who emerged during the era of the silent generation's maturing. And one listen to Jack Kerouac, it's easy to understand the draw.
Well, a lot of people have asked me why did I write that book or any book. All the stories I wrote were true because I believed in what I saw. I was traveling west one time at the junction of the state line of Colorado, its arid western one, and the state line of poor Utah. I saw in the clouds huge and massed above the fiery golden desert of even fall, the great image of God with forefinger pointed straight at me, through halos and rolls and gold folds that were like the existence of the gleaming spear in his right hand, which saith, "Come on, boy, go thou across the ground. Go moan for man. Go moan. Go groan. Go groan alone. Go roll your bones alone."
The Beatnik culture rejected conformity, seeking spiritual meaning, opposing materialism, while openly depicting the human experience, experimentation, and embracing sexual freedom. Allen Ginsberg's Howl in 1956, Jack Kerouac's On the Road in 1957, and William Burroughs' Naked Lunch in 1959 are among the best-known examples of the Beat literature. Both Howl and Naked Lunch were the focus of obscenity trials that ultimately helped to free publishing from censorship in the United States. We'll get more into that later on. The members of the Beat generation developed a reputation as new bohemian hedonists who celebrated spontaneous creativity. But it was On the Road that struck a nerve with the coming-of-age generation that led to them desiring the protagonist's approach to living a freewheeling life set against a backdrop of jazz, poetry, and the open road.
So, in America, when the sun goes down, and I sit on the old broken-down river pier watching the long, long skies over New Jersey and sense all that raw land that rolls in one unbelievable huge bulge over to the west coast, and all that road going, and all the people dreaming in the immensity of it.
Dean Moriarty's carefree attitude and sense of adventure resonated deeply with a generation who were raised in American homes with a life of expectations laid out in front of them, many of whom had never left the safety of their small towns. Even Kerouac's approach to writing was nonconformist, as he famously wrote on the road in a free-flowing, unstructured form of stream of consciousness on a 120-foot scroll of paper taped together as not to interrupt his rhythm of words, with no grammatical corrections, single-spaced with no paragraphs. Kerouac had a major impact on the music of the 1960s. Artists including Bob Dylan, the Beatles, Patti Smith, Tom Waits, the Grateful Dead, and the Doors all credit Kerouac as a significant influence. In his book Light My Fire, My Life with the Doors, Ray Manzarek wrote, "I suppose if Jack Kerouac had never written on the road, the Doors would have never existed." And there were plenty of mad experiences for Kerouac to draw inspiration from. This bunch had troubles from the get-go. There are a couple of dark events of the early Beat days. The Beats came together in New York towards the end of the war. One of the members of their bohemian group was Lucien Carr, who was a Columbia student where he met Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg. He introduced his two friends to his friend William Burroughs. Kerouac lived in an apartment with his girlfriend Edie Parker and Joan Vollmer, which became the focus of the newly formed circle of friends. The trio of Burroughs, Ginsberg, and Kerouac was to form the heart of the literary beat movement. Lucien had a relationship with an older man, David Kammerer, who is said to have become obsessed with him. An incident unfolded in Riverside Park which led to Kammerer's body being dumped in the Hudson River. Carr claimed it was self-defense. He went to Burroughs and Kerouac for help. When Carr later turned himself in, both Burroughs and Kerouac were arrested as material witnesses. Both had helped dispose of evidence. They were both eventually bailed out. Carr pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter, and his mother testified at sentencing about Kammerer's predatory habits. Carr was sentenced to a term of 1 to 20 years in prison. He served 2 years before being released. Years later, several people came forward with what was termed the Lucien myth, that Carr had been the victim of Kammerer's relentless obsession and stalking. They claim it was the other way around, that Carr was obsessed with Kammerer. Several of the Beats used the incident in their writings with fictional retellings. There is even a film about the incident from 2013, Kill Your Darlings. Carr went on to be a successful journalist, serving as the best man in one of Kerouac's weddings, and sometimes being credited with having provided Kerouac with the roll of teleprinter paper he used for writing on the road. Then there was William Burroughs. By the early 1950s, Burroughs was a key figure in the emerging Beat generation, known for his dark, introspective writing and experimentation. At this time, he was living in Mexico City with his common-law wife, Joan Vollmer. As mentioned earlier, lived with Kerouac and his girlfriend as the group was forming. They were fleeing Burroughs' legal trouble in the U.S. Vollmer had a complicated and volatile relationship with Burroughs, marked by instability. She was the mother of one child with Burroughs and another from a previous relationship. The couple's life in Mexico City was unhappy and chaotic. Burroughs had a fascination with guns. On September 6, 1951, at a small gathering with friends, they were drinking heavily. Burroughs proposed a William Tell act, reference to the legend where an arrow is shot to knock an apple off someone's head. Vollmer reportedly placed a glass on her head, and Burroughs aimed at the glass. In a horrific turn, Burroughs missed the glass and instead hit Vollmer in the forehead, killing her instantly. Burroughs was convicted of manslaughter and received a 2-year suspended sentence. He later stated that this tragedy compelled him to pursue writing seriously. He claimed that without Vollmer's death, he might have never written his most famous works such as Naked Lunch. He saw the event as pivotal to his understanding of the ugly spirit within himself. The soundtrack of the Beat movement was modern jazz, which was dubbed bebop. Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk, and Miles Davis rapidly became what Ginsberg hailed as secret heroes. Many key figures of the Beat generation eventually gravitated towards North Beach in the late 1950s. San Francisco offered a fertile ground for their ideas, with its existing jazz clubs and coffee houses providing a welcoming environment for their creative expression. Jazz clubs were central to the scene, influencing the improvisational and free-flowing nature of beat poetry. Some would head back to New York after growing restless. The movement was fluid, with many key figures living nomadically. They traveled across the country and abroad, seeking new experiences and inspiration. The beat authors borrowed much from the 1940s hipster slang of the jazz scene, peppering their works with lingo such as square, cats, cool, and dig. Beat philosophy was generally countercultural, stressing the importance of actual living over material possessions. Their lifestyle of anti-consumerism may have been influenced by living through the Great Depression during their formative years. By 1958, many beat writers published works on Buddhism. This was the year that Jack Kerouac published his novel, The Dharma Bums. While the Beats focused on literature, spirituality, and philosophical critique of society, the Beatniks were a subculture disillusioned with mainstream society and inspired by and aspired to be like the beat figures they admired. In the 1950s, the burgeoning beatnik scene of Greenwich Village inspired a new wave of artists, poets, and free thinkers to flock to its smoky coffee houses and dimly lit basements. Drawn by the promise of creative freedom and cheap rent, aspiring writers and jazz enthusiasts could find rooms in the village for just $50 to $70 a month. Sometimes they shared cramped apartments with fellow bohemians. By the day, they wandered the streets in the park, reading and scribbling poetry in their notebooks, some playing guitar. By the night, they filled venues like the Gaslight, Cafe Wah, performing impromptu poetry reading and jazz improvisations. The village became a hub where beatniks could live cheaply, immerse themselves in their art, and be just steps away from the next happening. Jack Kerouac's appearance on The Steve Allen Show in 1959 remains one of the most iconic televised moments of the Beat generation.
You're typing paper, but instead you prefer to use one big long roll of paper. Is that true?
Yeah. When I write narrative novels and I want to change my narrative thought, I keep going.
Dressed in a casual suit, Kerouac read an excerpt from his seminal work, On the Road, with a rhythmic, hypnotic cadence that reflected the book's stream of conscious style. The segment introduced a wider audience to Kerouac's work while also underscoring the Beats' improvisational connection to jazz, further solidifying their cultural impact.
I got the most hard question of all, but everybody always puts it to you, I'm sure. I mean, because everybody always puts it to you. How would you define the word beat? I don't mean why not time. I mean, really, is there...
Sympathetic.
Sympathetic? All right.
And tonight the stars will be out. And don't you know that God is Pooh Bear? The evening star must be drooping and shedding her sparkler dims on the prairie, which is just before the coming of complete night that blesses the earth.
But the Beats rejected the beatnik term, with Allen Ginsberg writing to the New York Times to deplore the foul word beatnik, commenting, "If beatniks and not illuminated beat poets overrun this country, they will be created not by Kerouac, but by industries of mass communication, which continue to brainwash man." Meanwhile, Jack Kerouac once responded, "I'm not a beatnik, I'm a Catholic," showing the reporter a painting of Pope Paul VI.
My heart broke in the general despair and opened up inwards to the Lord.
The term beatnik was coined by a San Francisco Chronicle columnist in 1958 as a derogatory label for the followers of the Beats. Beat was slang for beaten down or downtrodden. However, to Kerouac and Ginsberg, it also had a spiritual connotation. Kerouac celebrated a class of people beaten down by society. It's not my fault that so-called bohemian elements have found in my writing something to hang their peculiar beatnik theories on. Jack Kerouac. Then there was Jean-Paul Sartre. If Kerouac helped them uncover their longing for freedom, Sartre uncovered their exploration of existentialism. He provided intellectual framework to explore questions of meaning, choice, and individual responsibility. I mean, why do we exist if we do exist? They believed in individualism and the meaning of life based on our own desires and the life we make for ourselves.
Not making chromium grills, not shuffling secret papers, selling deodorants, not doing anything important. Just mill around causing trouble, asking questions, thinking.
The Beatniks were the first subculture to employ all-black attire. They loved the French Breton shirts and berets, and of course the black turtleneck and dark sunglasses. The women often wore things like black flats and skinny jeans above the ankle. This look is still such a classic. Since they were aspiring artists, they would wear artist smocks as dresses over black leggings and often no shoes. The men wore beards and grew their hair out, which was an outrageous practice during the clean-cut Cold War era. The women, on the other hand, would sometimes crop their hair short, similar to how the mod girls did it, rejecting mainstream long-haired femininity. They were often seen rolling their own cigarettes and playing bongos. Marijuana use was associated with the subculture, and during the 1950s, Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception furthered this practice. They sought out to destroy the wall between art and real life, so that art would become a living experience in cafes and jazz clubs, and not remain the prerogative of galleries and museums. Jean Seberg was an iconic Beatnik movie star. She is considered an icon of the French New Wave as a result of her performance in Godard's 1960 film Breathless. In 1957, Audrey Hepburn starred in Funny Face, which featured a Beatnik dance scene. They snapped their fingers instead of clapping as to not disturb the residential neighbors living above the coffee houses they hung out and performed in. But most importantly, they loved jazz music. They spent late nights in jazz clubs in the Village and around New York, and that would spill over into someone's apartment, staying up philosophizing into the daylight. The 1957 Howl obscenity trial in San Francisco was a pivotal moment in American cultural history, cementing Allen Ginsberg and his poem as enduring symbols of free expression. Published in 1956, Howl and other poems shocked authorities with its raw portrayal of taboo topics such as sexuality, mental illness, and alienation. When U.S. Customs seized the second printing and police arrested publisher Lawrence Ferlinghetti for selling the book, the ensuing trial became a battle over artistic freedom. Presided over by Judge Clayton Horn, the trial pitted the prosecution's claims of obscenity against the defense's argument that Howl was a groundbreaking work of literary merit. Experts testified to its significance, emphasizing its critique of societal oppression and its bold, essential language. Judge Horn, a devout Christian and Sunday school teacher, surprised many by taking a thoughtful approach. He read the entire poem and engaged deeply with its arguments, ultimately ruling in favor of Ferlinghetti. In his decision, Horn declared that Howl was not obscene as it had redeeming social importance and could not be judged solely on its controversial language. The verdict protected the poem, elevated Ginsberg as a cultural icon, and paved the way for greater artistic experimentation. More than a legal battle, the trial symbolized a nation in transition, challenging the restrictive norms of the 1950s and embracing the rise of individualism and creative freedom. Coincidentally, the same Judge Horn oversaw Lenny Bruce's obscenity trial in 1962, in which he was ultimately acquitted. Excerpts from Naked Lunch were first published in the United States in 1958 and deemed obscene by a Chicago Daily News columnist. The United States Postmaster General ruled that copies could not be mailed to subscribers on the basis of obscenity laws. Once published in the United States, Naked Lunch was persecuted as obscene by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, followed by other states. In 1966, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court declared the work not obscene on the basis of criteria developed largely to defend the book. The case against Burroughs' novel still stands as the last obscenity trial against a work of literature that is a work consisting of words and not photos and illustrations.
Don't you think that singing is nothing but an extension of speech?
Yeah, who stopped you from singing?
In 1961, Izzy Young was running the Folklore Center at McDougal Street, a few blocks away from the park. At this time, it was the heart of the Greenwich Village folk scene, a hangout for amateurs and professionals, including Bob Dylan and Dave Von Ronk. Young was the one who applied for the Washington Square Park permit in the first place, and when it was rejected, he helped organize the protest.
You walk through the park, no singing, no instruments.
Well, some people may sing, it's their free choice. It's our God-given right to sing.
I know.
It's just an extension of speaking. Since the American Revolution, people have been singing American folk songs, and we feel we have a perfect right to sing.
Come, let's go to the park now.
And I think
You can appreciate opposition.
I understand the police don't want to even be involved in it. I've spoken to a dozen policemen. The police are in the middle of it.
Well, I don't think that it's the police's fault. The police are simply doing their job.
The Beatnik riot at Washington Square Park in New York City took place in April 1961, sparked a clash between the burgeoning counterculture and city authorities. For years, the park had been a haven for beatniks, folk musicians, and bohemians who gathered to play music, read poetry, and socialize. However, city officials, citing noise complaints and crowd control concerns, imposed a ban on music performance in the park. This move was seen by the artistic community as a direct attack on free expression and their right to public spaces. On April 9, 1961, hundreds of people, including beatniks, musicians, and supporters, gathered in the park to protest the ban. The demonstration quickly escalated to a confrontation with the police, and the crowd defiantly sang and played music in defiance of the new regulations. The police responded by arresting several protesters, which only fueled tensions further. The event came to be known as the Beatnik riots, highlighting the growing divide between the counterculture and urban authorities. It also drew national attention to issues of free speech, public assembly, and the rights of artists. While the ban was eventually lifted, the riots cemented Washington Square Park's reputation as a focal point for activism and cultural resistance in New York City. The commercialization of beatniks by the media was the turning point. The media began portraying beatniks as cliché symbols of rebellion, beret-wearing, bongo-playing, and nonsensically poetic, stripping away the essence of their philosophical and literary ideals. TV shows like Many Loves of Dobie Gillis featured beatnik characters for comedic effect. Coffee houses and poetry readings, originally spaces for authentic expression, became trendy and commodified. The bohemian lifestyle became a fashion statement. Before long, the acceptance of the beatnik descent from mainstream morphed into the emergence of a fad. The cultural protest transformed into a commodity. The once feared subculture was mocked. The materialism that they rejected was undermined with commercial products such as beatnik kits, rent a beatnik, all kinds of fashion apparel, and silly products. As the beatnik image was co-opted by the mainstream, the movement lost credibility among intellectuals and its own supporters. What had started as a rejection of materialism and conformity became just another consumer product.
Well, of course, he started a cultural revolution of unprecedented worldwide extent.
Yet he didn't acknowledge it.
Well, he didn't acknowledge it, but he was one of the people instrumental in starting it.
Well, I mean, in what sense?
Well, the whole beat movement,
Well, in what?
which has become a worldwide cultural revolution, absolutely unprecedented. There's never been anything like it before. Penetrating the Arab countries, which was really a hermetic society, And then their affiliation with the political activists, all that went on in the 60s. Although the Beats were originally non-political, others who were political were really following the Beat movement to its logical conclusion.
But Kerouac didn't seem to have any sense of that or desire for it or acceptance of it.
Well, no, he didn't. He was completely apolitical. I don't think he ever took part in a demonstration or signed a petition. But he started it. As Jesus Christ said, by their fruits ye shall know them, not by their disclaimers.
Jack Kerouac, the most famous Beat figure, became deeply resentful of how the movement was portrayed and misrepresented. His dissatisfaction of the Beatnik label and his retreat from public life signaled a fraction within the movement's core. Once the counterculture began to morph from Beatniks to hippies, the Beats splintered into different directions. Allen Ginsberg embraced the hippie movement, while Jack Kerouac did not.
We've just been back and forth across the country several times in cars, and now our adventures are over. We're still great friends, but we have to go into later phases of our lives.
Despite the role which his literary work portrayed in inspiring the countercultural movement of the 1960s, Kerouac was openly critical of it. Arguments over the movement, which Kerouac believed was only an excuse to be spiteful, also resulted in him splitting with Ginsberg in 1968. Also in 1968, Kerouac last appeared on television for Firing Line, produced and hosted by William F. Buckley Jr., a friend of his from college. Seemingly intoxicated, he affirmed his Catholicism and talked about the counterculture of the 1960s.
The hippies are good kids. They're better than the Beats. See, Ginsberg and I, and wow, Ginsberg, boy. We're all in our 40s, and we started this, and the kids took it up and everything. But a lot of hoodlums, and communists jumped on our backs. Well, on my back, not his. Ferlinghetti jumped on my back and turned the idea that I had that the Beat generation was a generation of beatitude and pleasure in life and tenderness. But they called it in the papers Beat mutiny, Beat insurrection, words I never used. Being a Catholic, I believe in order, tenderness, and piety.
Neal Cassady, the charismatic figure who inspired Kerouac's on-the-road character Dean Moriarty, was a central figure in the Beat circle, died in 1968. His death symbolized the fading of the original Beat spirit and the loss of the key cultural icon. Then in 1969, Kerouac's death from complications related to alcoholism marked the literal and symbolic end of the Beatnik era. And the most publicly recognized Beat figure, his passing left the movement with its reluctant but central icon. Kerouac's death sealed the movement's fate as a bygone cultural movement rather than a living and evolving subculture. Internal struggles of icons spilled over into broader society, and its aftermath is what led to the dissolving of the Beatnik subculture into the hippie subculture. Well, there wasn't a singular event that defiantly ended the Beatnik movement. The commercialization of the beat culture in the late 1950s and early 1960s is perhaps the most significant factor that contributed to its decline. The shift diluted the original ethos of the movement, alienating its core figures and reducing the movement to a caricature. While events such as Neal Cassady's death and Kerouac's personal struggles were significant, they were more symptomatic for broader societal issues. Without its authenticity and key figures, the Beatnik movement lost its unique appeal and became overshadowed by the rise of the hippie counterculture, which carried forward many of its ideals in a more vibrant, communal, and politically active form. Subcultures attract all kinds of motivations, which over time depletes its original credibility with superficiality. But the Beatniks' lasting legacy is their win for freedom of expression and a broader acceptance of diverse lifestyles, challenging the notion of a single right way to live. Even some of their lingo is still used today. At its core, the Beatniks were expressing freedom. a desire ingrained in human nature that transcends time, culture, and circumstance. This innate feeling reflects our need for autonomy, self-expression, and the ability to shape our own lives, which is central to our sense of identity and self-worth. To live freely is to align our choices with our values and connect authentically with the world around us. Even the Bible emphasizes the idea that every individual is uniquely created by God with inherent value, purpose, and gifts. America has been shaped by a spirit of rebellion against the establishment, from the pilgrims seeking religious freedom to flappers, bikers, and beatniks challenging societal norms in their own ways. Maybe to be an American is to be a beatnik. So we end this video honoring the freewheeling ideas of the beatniks, their quest for freedom, creativity, and exploring life's deeper meaning. They dared to challenge the norms of their time and left a legacy that still inspires today. Let their story remind us to live with curiosity and courage while embracing our own unique journey.
Nobody knows what's going to happen to anybody besides the forlorn rags of growing old. Think of Dean Moriarty, or even think of old Dean Moriarty, the father we never found. Think of Dean Moriarty, I think of Dean Moriarty.